Welcome everyone to the kickoff of the workshop series Stories from the Future, Crisis as a Catalyst for Carbon Neutrality. My name is Daniela Silvestrin and I'm part of the curatorial team behind the program Collective Practices at Akut Macht Neu in Berlin, which is the context in which this workshop series is taking place. Before handing over the word to Lisa Pettibone and Dylan Harris, who will be moderating and facilitating this workshop together, I just quickly wanted to say a few words about the Collective Practices program in general. Collective Practices will run until January 2021, and its aim is to examine various forms and notions of collective practice as they relate to artistic creation or cultural organizing or social coexistence. We will look at what practice in collectivity means by addressing and exploring a broad field of practices, methods, and questions related to forms of collectivity, multiple authorship, social living and working together, and other aspects. With a bit of delay due to this, to the changes and restrictions imposed by the corona pandemic, we are finally now starting our program, actually with this workshop series and today. So we're really excited about that. And next week, we will also launch our new website. And starting from today, we will be offering several other series and single events that range from workshops, readings, listening sessions to performances and other formats. You can find all the information and materials related to this program on our websites, which is akutmachtneu.de, and from next week on also collectivepractices.net. All this was made possible through the funding of the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds. And in such insecure times for cultural production, we are, of course, even more grateful for the support and funding. And so a big thank you goes out to HKF at this point, and another one to my colleague Olga Wiedemann behind the scenes for the great organization and setting up of the event. Last but not least, I wanted to thank and also introduce, at least quickly, the two facilitators and moderators of this workshop series, Lisa Pettibone and Dylan Harris. Lisa is an independent sustainability teacher, researcher, and writer, and a very creative mind. She combines her scientific and creative interests by running a podcast series called My Climate Diet. She reflects on queer and feminist theory by way of speculative lecture performances, and she's currently also writing her first speculative fiction novel. Dylan is an assistant professor of geography and environmental studies at the University of Colorado Springs, and he has a background in creative writing. His work focuses on the ways that cultural and environmental narratives overlap and inform one another, and on the transformative capacities of stories and storytelling. So thanks a lot to both of you for starting into this adventure and time travel with us. And without further ado, I give the word to Lisa and Dylan.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And thank you, Daniela, for inviting me in the first place. Daniela met me through a presentation that I gave last year on drag utopias in an alternate universe. And the fact that anyone saw that presentation with interspecies drag performers writing and performing utopias on another planet, that someone would see that and think, yeah, that's someone who could maybe do more work that's interesting. Yeah, that makes me happy. So thank you all for joining us. And I think the watchword here really is collective practices, because we are in very, very challenging times. But for me, as a utopian thinker, I would like to hope that we can use these challenging times to come out the other side in a better place. And that is really the goal of these workshops, is for us to come together to figure out what is this better place we want to be in? What does it look like in 2030 specifically? And what are some creative artifacts that we can produce together to bring back from this better place and share with others we know and don't know in these troubling times in 2020, to get them as motivated as we are to get out of this really challenging, really crappy 2020 into a 2030 that is meaningful, that is better, that has just a better quality of life for everybody, not just for some. So as I started kind of working on developing these workshops, I knew that I wanted to get at least one other person on board. And so I was over the moon when I got an email from Dylan Harris. We actually, our first Zoom conversation was basically like the mutual fan club, because he's an editor at an online magazine that I really, really look up to, Not Afraid of the Ruins at the Uneven Earth, which if you haven't heard of it, you definitely need to check it out. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dylan as kind of my partner in crime over the next few months. Dylan.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I'm mindful of time here. Just again, my name's Dylan. Lisa did get in touch with me kind of through this Not Afraid of the Ruins network, which is again a blog magazine that does focus on these issues of kind of how we plan the future, not again just for some, but for all people, and to really move past these apocalyptic narratives of the future to think a bit more creatively and expansively about what's possible. And it's on that note, and thank you, Miriam, for bringing this up. But within this year, within these times, it's so important to acknowledge that speculating, thinking of the future, looking ahead is such a privilege. I think it's important to acknowledge, as we have in our chat here, that most of us are white. Most science fiction writers are white. Most speculative thinkers are white. That's not to say there isn't important people of color in those worlds, and we need to certainly lift them up. We will certainly talk about that throughout this presentation or workshop. My name is representative of that, but that's all a gesture, right? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I just want to kind of flag and signal that prefigurative politics, which is again, the way we create the world in the present that we want in the future, right? And that's all happening right around us. And we need to lift that up and acknowledge that. And just keeping in mind that 2030 is something we can think about, but for many people, right, they're fighting now to see what tomorrow's like. So I think when we think about the future, we need to kind of live in both realities. And I just wanted to thank Miriam for reminding us to think about that and to sort of keep that in perspective as we move forward, because again, it's hard to talk about the future when we don't even know which lives matter, in this present. So with that, I'll just sort of let the show go on.
Thank you, Dylan. So before we get into the presentations that we have kind of in the middle of the live stream and kind of to set us up for the workshop, I want to make sure that the goals and the agenda are clear. So we have 3 big things that we want to accomplish today. And remember that this is the first of 4 public workshops. There are also going to be private meetings within the group between each of these workshops so that we can work through whatever it is that we need to, and also hopefully present the cool stuff that we're working on. So the first goal of this workshop is to get to know each other. Who are we, right? Where do we come from? What do we bring with us? What knowledge, what enthusiasm, what problems and concerns? Where are we, right, in the world? Now that we're doing this online, we're not just all based in Berlin. The second goal, and also where are we going and where do we want to go? The second goal of the workshop is to get some first inputs on the crisis that we find ourselves in now. This is something that we're also going to be really hashing out together. Is there one crisis we can all agree on, or are there multiple crises? Are they interconnected? Are there areas maybe where we don't agree on what's wrong right now? And also that we want to get some first inputs on narratives and storytelling as part of the solution. So how can we use narratives? How can we use speculation to start thinking about a better future and a way out of this crisis that we find ourselves in now? The third goal of this workshop today is to openly discuss what our goals are as a group. So, I mean, this kind of came out of a Word document that I wrote to Daniela, right? That was the first step of this. But these workshops and this project really is collective. So that means that Word document that I wrote, we might have to kind of rip it up and come up with something that works better for us. So in thinking about what do stories for the future mean to us, what is it that we want to create together, how is it that we want to interact and relate to each other, we also want to make sure that we think about our collective goals as a group, but also our individual goals, because each of you comes from a particular individual context where maybe you need to write an academic paper to get tenure. Maybe you want to finish a short story that you're working on. Maybe you're a musician and you want to share music. Maybe you're an activist and you want to widen your network or get some new methods. So this we want to also have time to work on. So those are the 3 goals of the workshop today. We have 2 hours together, so we really need to get to it, right? And let's start with getting to know each other with some capsule introductions. So the way that we're going to do this is we have all given ourselves speculative names for these workshops, and I want us to introduce ourselves with our first name, our speculative name. Obviously, this is not necessarily going to be clear to everyone where that speculative name comes from. That's something we're going to get into later in the workshop. And then 3 hashtags that describe you. Okay, and the organizers, we're going to introduce ourselves first so you get a sense of how it works. Olga is going to write a list of the order for the rest of the introductions. So I will start so you get a sense of how easy and painless this is. Also, those of you who don't want to introduce yourself, please mention that in the chat that you want to be skipped. So I'm Lisa, also known as Doc Sarvis for these workshops. And my hashtags are hashtag sustainability geek, hashtag teacher for future, and hashtag feminist utopian. Dylan, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Dylan. My, I guess, name for this workshop is Uloy Winter, which maybe some folks are aware, winter with a Y. And my hashtags are storytelling, climate change, and post-human.
Yeah, so my Daniela, and then I'm also known as Noah Octavia Butler. And my 3 hashtags will be, or are creative work, future, and post-humanism.
Hey, I'm Olga, and my name is Trinity, and my hashtags are hashtag artsy, hashtag production, hashtag sustainable travel.
Hi, Alessandra, Bianca, and hashtag learner, hashtag listener, hashtag justice.
Hi, I'm Mike, the Lorax, and my 3 hashtags are sustainability transitions, mobility justice, and audiophile.
Hello, I'm Mel. I'm in England, otherwise known as Oryx, from Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. Hashtags child rights, eco-social, I'm really into that blend, and playful.
Nice, thank you.
Doreen, Mimi, and my hashtags are hashtag prof, hashtag gardener, hashtag new world midwife.
Hi everyone, my name's Heather, and for this collective, my name is Stardust. My hashtags are carbon colonialism must die, hashtag indigenous knowledge is sustainability, and hashtag a shared future.
I am Miriam Belvedere, and I am uplifting Octavia Butler in this. And my 3 hashtags are hashtag New Orleans, hashtag Imagine Waterworks, and hashtag racial justice is climate justice.
I'm Lena, or also known as Pippi Longstocking, and my hashtags are hashtag SDGs, hashtag curious, and hashtag let's do it.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm in Berlin, and my nickname for this is Ardenil. And my hashtags are climate justice, future anthropology, and film geek.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristen. My speculative name for this workshop is Polaris, and my hashtags are geo-oceanography, wilderness feminist, and hashtag Alaskan warming stripes.
My name is Lavinia, and my nickname will be Tejano. My 3 hashtags are Haraway, linguistics, and walking.
Thank you.
Antonius, my temporary nickname is Bucky Fuller, and my hashtags are Curious Cat, Creative Soul, and Gamification Enthusiast.
Hi, I'm Hannah, also known as Ness, and my hashtags are regenerative living, storied landscapes, and entanglement.
Hi, my name is Sarah, also Anne of Green Gables, and the hashtags I chose are Pittsburgh, neighborhoods, and gardening.
Hello, my name is Francisca, or my nickname is Helen, and my hashtags are ocean, creativity, and low carbon conference.
Hi, my name is Glenn, Eco Avatar. My hashtags are Future Rivers, Speak the Sounds, and Sonic Futures.
Marit, yeah. So yeah, my nickname is Mizia, and my hashtags are movement thinking, hope making, and collaboration.
Our next step is I'm going to give you a little bit of a presentation to get us all on the same page on climate change. Now, the caveat with this is I'm guessing all of you knows something about climate change, about the climate crisis. I'm kind of framing this, although it is a presentation on kind of scientific knowledge, that this is not the only way to see the climate crisis. And I want to set this up as kind of a first step for discussion, okay? So I'm framing this in terms of narratives that are used in the scientific community, and I'm also using kind of a time capsule approach to get our heads in the space of moving from 2020 to 2030. So I've called it 10 years forward, 10 years back. We're starting, however, at 1970. So 1970, the world population was 3.7 billion. The largest political event that year was the ratification of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The first Earth Day also took place in 1970. And the Hugo Award, which is a democratically selected science fiction award, the Hugo Award for Best Novel was given to The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. So I know there are a couple Le Guin fans here. 1970, big year for her. The global temperature increase from 1900 was 0.3 degrees Celsius. And I would argue that an iconic scientific report that came out in the 1970s was The Limits to Growth by Meadows et al. And kind of the capsule review of Limits to Growth is it said, if we continue using material resources at the rate that we are doing, we will almost certainly face socioeconomic collapse in the 21st century. So now we go to 1980. World population increased, as did global temperature rise. The largest political event, or I'll say one large political event that's noteworthy, is Ronald Reagan was elected US president. This was really the beginning of the kind of normalization of neoliberal politics in the US and in much of the global north. In terms of climate, the World Climate Program, which was the precursor to the IPCC, was established. What we also saw was the publication of the global report to the president that was requested by President Jimmy Carter in the US. Here, what I find very interesting in this report is you see this chart of expected temperature change by the year 2000 as measured by interviews with climate experts. So they're not modeling climate change yet. They're asking people they think who would know what they think the probability is of a certain amount of rising. So you also see the difference between experts who are considered they totally know their stuff and people who are quite familiar with climate change. And you can see that the warming actually observed really hits right in the middle. So they did a pretty good job. In 1990, world population, no surprise, keeps going up. Global temperature rise keeps going up. The Cold War has ended. This throws everything overboard, right? All that we cared about in the 70s and 80s was nuclear war. Is capitalism better than communism? Now we don't have this conflict anymore. The IPCC has been established, and Hyperion wins the Hugo Award for Best Novel. Cumulative emissions projections are released by the IPCC in its first report, which is a report on scenarios. I find this also especially important to bring up in these workshops because the IPCC scenarios are kind of like what we're trying to do, right? They imagine the ways in which human civilization can progress to 2100 and ask, what does that mean for global climate emissions? So here they set out a list of different scenarios and what that means for carbon emissions. Cumulative emissions by 2019 in actuality were 20 gigatons, so above their highest scenario in that year. In 2000, world population keeps growing. A huge political event is the growing anti-globalization movement, seen, for example, iconically in the protests of the WTO meeting in Seattle. We see in terms of climate change, Agenda 21, which was at the time a very important movement to get countries and local governments to develop a sustainability plan. They're on the way in many countries, particularly in Europe, for example, and they're on their way out in other countries, for example, in the US. The Hugo Award goes to A Deepness in the Sky, global temperature still on the rise. In 2010, world population has reached almost 7 billion, and now we're feeling the after effects of a global financial crisis. In addition, the climate community is on the defense after ClimateGate, the release of internal emails from IPCC members. The Hugo Award is a tie between The City and the City and The Wind-Up Girl. The Wind-Up Girl, very often referred to as an excellent example of climate fiction. I would go further and say it's an example of sustainability fiction because it's really more about biodiversity and how do we deal with biological material. An important scientific publication around this time is the notion of planetary boundaries, a article in Nature by Johan Lökström and his colleagues that says, you know what, climate change is one crisis that we face, but it's one of several environmental crises that are interconnected, and climate change is not actually the worst. If you see here, the planetary boundaries that he imagines are this green circle, and yes, we have exceeded them in terms of climate change, but we're far off the chart with biodiversity and the nitrogen cycle, issues that get dramatically less attention than climate change. So here, much like with the limits to growth, the question is the frame of climate crisis enough to understand how we want to shift? In 2020, we're living it now. We've already talked a little bit about what the big political events are this year. As we were drafting this first workshop, COVID-19 was the big one. Now with the increased police violence in the United States, we have to ask ourselves, is authoritarianism, is racism another big crisis that we really need to focus on in 2020? We've seen the growth of a global environmental protest movement with the Sunrise Movement, with Fridays for Future, with Extinction Rebellion, and many, many more. What's going to happen with them under lockdown? We don't know. In terms of the climate crisis, we've seen this year the largest fall ever in global emissions. However, for 2030, this is not the best news because we need even larger cuts than we've seen to reach the goal of 1.5 degrees of warming that the IPCC says is the absolute maximum amount of global warming that we can see to avoid dramatic climatic collapse. So what does 2030 look like? This is where we come in. We've seen population projections that we're going to have about 8.5 billion people on the planet in 2030. What are the main political events going to be? What are the main climate events going to be? Who's going to win the Hugo Award? We want to know all of these things. Our goal is that the global temperature increase does not exceed 1.25 degrees Celsius by this time, but there's so much other stuff up in the air. This is kind of where I wanted to start the discussion. So that's my short presentation. I'm happy to hear your thoughts. What have I missed on this? Is climate even the right place to start, and carbon neutrality? I think the main here, if no one is raising their hands immediately, one question that I have for you is the way that I have been framing this in my mind is, well, the question, to repeat my question so you can think about it, is how can we frame the problem that we want to address by 2030? Is the problem the climate crisis and getting to carbon neutrality? Or is it something bigger, something smaller, something specific? Do we have a specific way that we want to get to carbon neutrality? I often think about the climate crisis under the frame of degrowth, that for me, only using technological advances to reduce carbon emissions is not going to get us anywhere. It's also not going to address major social inequalities and major racial inequalities that we have today. That we need a fundamental change of how we think about the world and what we want the world to look like. That we don't want to be richer as our goal. That's the way that I think about the climate crisis. And I also think about the climate crisis as a smaller piece of a larger sustainability crisis. But I want to just throw that out there for all of you. Is this, I'm seeing kind of some thoughtful looks that maybe you don't have an answer yet, but you like thinking about this as a question. Is there anyone who has it? I'm seeing Mel, do you want to answer? And then I saw Miriam's hand as well.
Yeah, I think the way to frame it is I'm deeply pluralist, so I think we have to think of it as that there is no one way, and to counter any kind of framing that says that my way or the highway, or that, you know, we need a total revolution. I think that it's incremental. There may be tipping points, but there's so many different, and part of the overwhelm is that there's so many different aspects of the multiple crises as we're seeing at the moment. You know, it's hard to know which way to look, which way to act, how to respond, where to fix. And it could be that solutions are very single issue focused. Something I've seen happen within activism is that in order to get success, you need to, for example, focus on getting a bike lane in a particular street in a particular city. That's the way to make change. You can't tackle it all, but to recognize and to frame it as diverse. And so to acknowledge difference within that. And the challenge is how we deal with the difference and the differences in view between us as well.
I really like that. Thank you. I've just learned about the pluriverse recently, and I think that's also a really nice way to think about there's not just one solution, there are a lot of solutions. Miriam, and then Heather.
I think that for me, part of the framing has to be what we're willing to give up in order to achieve this outcome. And by this outcome, I mean the ability to continue living. And I don't think that you can address the problem without addressing whiteness and white supremacy, right? So these are interconnected problems of racism, of capitalism. And if we are going to get anywhere by 2030, that means giving up power. And that is something that we struggle with, especially those people who may not think of themselves as having power. So white women or people who are queer or gay. And so I think that part of this has to be a framing around what are we willing to give up and how can we push that power to Indigenous people, to Black people who will lead us, who have always led us.
I'm going to end up echoing a lot of what we just heard Miriam say. One of the hashtags that I didn't use but was thinking about was hashtag white supremacy must die. And I think it sort of goes hand in hand as well with what I heard the previous speaker say around the plurality of the issues. And I think in some areas of science, we hear about wicked problems and, you know, that there is no one solution or that we can't think of it in a siloed kind of way. And that's where I turn to Indigenous knowledge systems that do think about the issues in a much more whole way, rather than in the more siloed way that Western thinkers have. And so, you know, I think we need to consider more than one knowledge system, obviously, and privilege the knowledge systems that are being quashed by some of the commentary that you gave around neoliberalism and you know, the 1% and how capitalism has to die. I don't know, like there needs to be those kinds of shifts, and I think it relates to the reading that you gave us too that really resonated for me. So those are the kinds of comments that I wanted to say, that we need to have a much broader perspective at tables and decision-making places.
Hi, without wanting to repeat what's all been said, maybe to add something would be the addition to your framing and the timeline of colonialism, and how that things like the last boarding school that was made for Indigenous people in America and Canada wasn't closed until the 90s. So we're still kind of living with that perpetuation in our recent history. So I think it's kind of an important part of the journey as well, kind of echoing what's already been said about multiple types of knowledge and valuing those, and how we use them alongside science and braiding them together, using the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer from Braiding Sweetgrass in her book. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Hi, so I live in India, a country where for many people degrowth is really not an aspiration, because they kind of need to grow to get certain decent living standards. And I just wanted to bring up the work of Narasimha Rao, who is a climate change professor at Yale. So he developed this decent living standards, where basically he came up with certain standards like the amount of living space a person can have and so. And in his lecture, he drew out a curve like how much would like the people who are below this need to rise, and how large is the space which is occupied above it. And this is just huge, which is occupied by like affluent people like us, or also me in India. Like I'm in the top 2% of earning people in India. Yeah, so just that like degrowth as such needs to be seen in the context of people who really are to grow a lot to sort of get to a state where they have like basic infrastructure access. And one more point I wanted to bring up is like aspiration, because here it's often like there's an aspiration to, or in general, there's this aspiration to become richer, like you said. And so we somehow need to change that it's actually an aspiration to not like own more material things, or to not become richer, but an aspiration to just like be able to be content with what you actually need for living, and that's it.
Yeah, so what I was thinking is, in your little in your presentation, you show important events and so on, but you don't really show how everyday life is like how big are people's houses, how do they move around. And yes, I know, as just said, this varies very much between different countries, and if we do it too centered on Western world, it will definitely not be great. But having an idea of what regular people's life will be like, I think that will be a huge motivation for people to be like, I want this future. When you look at, there's a new book out by Christina Figueres and Tom Riveter-Karnak. It's The Future We Choose. And in there, and they also have a lot of little videos where they say it is, they show us two futures for 2050. One is like you have to actually check weather reports and so on to even go outside because climate is so bad. And the other one, everything is green, and you love, like you, even if you live in the city, you actually live kind of in a forest. And that really makes you want to be part of that new future with a lot of cool technology, a lot of plants and so on. And you can see yourself living in it.
And of course, as everyone has echoed, I completely agree with everything that everyone has said. One point that I want to throw into the conversation, and from something that I think we could continue to marinate on as we move forward in these workshops, is I think kind of going back to Lisa's kind of first fundamental question is how we frame the problem. For me, I kind of think more simplistically in this sense. I think that, and I say this as someone, as I've been an active researcher in the Arctic climate change world for almost a decade now. And as an Alaskan, one thing that we always talk about that we've actually seen some successful strides forward in terms of creating relevant, meaningful policies on the local level is forging a connection between just scientific observation and like visceral felt understanding for what climate change actually means. You know, there's a big difference between seeing a graph of a warming trend in an area, but then seeing a house fall into the ocean. And so for me, one thing that I kind of want to keep, that I would like to kind of keep rooting us back to is kind of this kind of practical question, just like as a baseline, how do we continue to talk about and reach out to people in our everyday worlds that bridge that understanding between observation and that felt understanding? Because I think there's a lot of work there to be done. And I think there's a lot of really interesting stories and compelling narratives that we could help bridge kind of these larger, very important, very relevant arcs, but you know, use these tools that we have to bring to start more simply and more on a local person to person level.
I think that is a perfect segue to our next presentation from Dylan. So without further ado, this notion that, yeah, we need to connect these graphs to a knowledge of what does climate look like in our everyday lives? What does climate mean to us? Dylan, how can narratives and storytelling help us here?
It's so good to see some familiar faces, by the way, and also for what it's worth, those familiar faces may have heard some of this before because this is based on some work I've been doing for a few years now, / my lifetime, on storytelling and crisis. Just a few things before I jump in. I do want to kind of reiterate and put into sort of placeholders here this conversation that Lena brought up about degrowth and those ongoing debates within that world of what does it mean to have a meaningful life and what does that look like? And I want to really focus on what it looks like with regards to storytelling. You know, some people already have lots, some people still need to grow a lot to have something. And this certainly circles back to conversations in the United States around racial justice, for example. It's kind of, it's a privilege to degrow, right? But that's not necessarily what that word means. So I just want to keep that context here. And also Kristen's point about visceral, right? How can we make these things that seem really distant and abstract, knowable and meaningful? And that's kind of where I want to jump in here with regards to storytelling and crisis. So here's someone you guys know lots about. It's one of my favorite writers. This is just sort of it's meant to be quiet. This video is just her gesturing. But basically, you know, she mentions that it matters what stories tell stories. I like this quote in as much as it really gets to the ambiguity of storytelling and what I want to reiterate here. So ultimately, what do we mean by stories? What is it, right? Is it fiction? Is it someone telling a story at a library? You know, I want to really think about what it is. What is narrative? What is story in the meta sense, right? With regards to how we frame these things. Again, what counts as a story? Who gets to be a storyteller, right? Who listens and who is listened to? I think there's a discussion here I want to kind of introduce as we move forward in this workshop between form and function. The form of storytelling has changed significantly over the span of existence, right? Again, I mentioned there's several ways to frame storytelling, but the function more or less remains the same, right? And I get asked a lot, well, what is it? What does it mean to tell a story? And I think at the end of the day, I would characterize it as just meaning making. It's making sense of something, right? And so if the form has changed, if it's something like The Moth, where we're telling personal stories, or if it's something like a science fiction novel, or if it's something like a piece of art, right? Or a performative piece, or in kind of the neoliberal sense, how corporations have begun to brand themselves, the form remains the same, right? We're trying to make sense of, well, the form changes, but the function remains the same. We're trying to make sense of the world. Sorry, I'm putting my timer on. I also want to introduce this idea of scale, right? So something about climate change that's really difficult, or any crisis that we're dealing with, sort of this entangled nature of climate change and racial justice and all these other issues we've brought up, is that they're really hard to imagine on the one hand, but that they're also so real on the other, right? They feel too big to deal with. And so there's a spatial and temporal question of what does the future look like? What does 100 years in the past look like? You know, when we think about climate change in particular, we're basing a future 100 years from now based on data we dug up that represents the atmosphere 2 million years ago, right? So there's this crazy question of scale that I think storytelling, again, in a meta sense, helps us wrap our heads around. And again, at the end of the day, I think storytelling is ultimately meaning making and sense making, right? So I don't want to necessarily hedge our conversations throughout the next few months as storytelling being one particular thing. I really want to encourage folks to come up with their own version of it. There, exactly. How would you define a story? Just really quickly, I want to kind of go through a very fast 100-year history of storytelling and climate and crisis. My sort of point of view, my starting point is climate change, but as folks have mentioned, there are so many things going on. This is a sort of Western timeline for what it's worth. This is something that came out of my research that was just sort of incidental. So I don't want to suggest that this is deterministic or that the world has to be this way or that there are necessarily 50-year cycles here. But you can look. In 1918, right, there was a world war, there was another global pandemic, economic recession. I have this Benjamin piece here, this essay many of you may have heard of, where he writes about how during that time period, storytelling was so important for making sense of the world. People were really exhausted with overwhelming information. There was a kind of, what am I trying to say? A dispersal of different kinds of news outlets, and people were really searching for something true and authentic. Similarly, in 1968, fast forward 50 years, we had another war situation, similar global struggles for justice. Instead of climate change, we were dealing with nuclear annihilation and kind of threats of that. And then at the same time, you had a similar moment in history where you had something like the founding of the International Storytelling Festival, which is one of the biggest festivals in the world. It's in Tennessee in the United States. And you also had several people writing about storytelling and the need for storytelling even then. And so fast forward to 2018, and as you guys may have known, or I've realized, and it's indicative by this workshop, storytelling is very much in vogue again, right? Everyone does it. Google does storytelling. Climate scientists want to do storytelling. The Moth is very popular. We're all here because we're interested in storytelling, but that really begs the question, well, what is it, you know? And I think, again, if we frame it as sense making or meaning making, that gives us a place to start in a really broad sense. But more than that, why are people so drawn to it? You know, why is it that in the context of multiple competing nested crises, there's a desire for it? And my sense of things really comes from the fact that, quite simply, crises don't make sense. Storytelling helps us make sense. Climate change doesn't make sense. We know about it, we can do science about it, but it really challenges what we understand as normal. You know, the weather changes, but the way we live on the planet isn't supposed to change. With that being said, crisis is very normal for some people, right? And again, I want to center Black Lives Matter as a moment, right? They live in crisis and in some states in the United States. This is an ongoing crisis. And so storytelling helps us navigate that. It helps us make sense of it. It helps us explain it to others. And again, to Kristen's point, it makes it visceral. Really quickly, I just want to run through, this is sort of based on my research. I'm not going to walk you through it or talk about my methods, but if you have questions, by all means, reach out. Effectively, throughout a couple of years of this research, I worked with several communities in Appalachia, where I currently am in West Virginia, and communities in Alaska, to get a sense of different practices of storytelling, different folks who do it differently, from indigenous storytelling in the Arctic to sort of folklorists in Appalachia here, to folks like the Moth and things like that. And effectively, over hundreds of interviews and just time thinking about this, there's four main roles, at least in 2018, 2020, that people talk about. And one is that storytelling creates community, right? In a time where everyone feels very individualized, everyone feels very sad and lonely, storytelling brings people together, basic, and that's something that became really clear in my notes. Technology, I want to kind of put a question mark, right? It came up a lot in my work, that people feel really isolated due to the rise of technology, that because of things like Facebook and Instagram, we have more quantity of friends than we've perhaps ever had in human history, but the quality is so shallow. And so storytelling introduces a way that's beyond that, or sort of goes through that, right? And of course, things like Instagram have stories at the top, right? and that's a powerful venue, but we have to think about how we use it, right? I want to kind of introduce this idea of facts, knowledge, and truth, right? You can tell the truth without using facts. Storytelling is really useful for that, right? With regards to climate change in particular, facts don't always work. Graphs are pretty useless to lots of people, right? But we can use stories to create truth about these issues without necessarily berating people with facts, right? It's a really subtle distinction that I want to introduce here. And I think this issue of authenticity is really, really important. It came up a lot in my work. And with regards to sort of the rise in global authoritarian populism that we're all sort of dealing with across the planet, people are drawn to folks like Trump, and they say this over and over again because he's authentic. He's perceived to be authentic. He's one of us, right? And I think in this vacuum, in this world we live in where people are struggling in the context of multiple crises, they want something true, genuine, authentic, and storytelling offers that, right? So there's a huge responsibility on us to craft meaningful stories, I think, and it's an opportunity. Because it is a battleground. You know, I think stories are the kind of cultural warfare in some ways, war of position. I'm not trying to get too technical here. Really quickly, I just want to introduce basically the kinds of stories that are being told. I'm kind of echoing Amitav Ghosh's work here, and happy to write that in the sort of box over there. But basically the story society values, again, Amitav Ghosh wrote this book, The Great Derangement, in 2016. Very simply, the stories we value as evidenced by year-end lists, award ceremonies, more or less since War and Peace, and we're thinking in the Western sense, they have increasingly narrowed in their focus. And so these days I have my little Marvel marquee over here where you have mostly white men in the front, saving the world, these kind of hero narratives, right? And I'm gonna signal hero here with regards to our discussion of Le Guin later, but you have these really popular movies that, again, people are paying attention to that really focus on one person's capacity to save the entire world. And I think that that's really indicative of, again, our neoliberal imagination, how damaged the way we think about things is, how it's impossible to think about collective issues because, again, our imaginations are so narrowed into thinking about these individual storylines. So again, back to Ghosh, the stories we value have increasingly narrowed while the problems we face have expanded. So we're totally at odds. In short, it's hard to imagine solutions to problems we can't even talk about, right? And so on the whichever side of the screen you're looking at, these are just some images from the wildfires last year in Australia, right? We have this huge problem and Thor's not gonna come fix it. You know, we have to really think about what it means to create stories collectively. And that's why I'm so drawn to this exercise. But again, these are the stories that are being valued. And I think this is no shade to the Moth, but things like the Moth and their popularity, they focus on one person's story. And there's an intention there that, you know, they can reach sort of the general human experience, these individual stories. And I don't doubt that, but essentially we need to think bigger. Mindful of time here, just want to signal the kinds of stories that maybe should be told. This is just a still from my work in Arctic Alaska. I was there for a few weeks. Hi, Kristen, I stayed at her house. Basically, this is right at the top of Alaska, Utqiagvik, the town. And I worked with a storyteller there throughout some workshops I ran as a part of my research. And what she did was find ways to collectively use folklore and indigenous storytelling to talk about the intersecting issues of colonialism, racism, suicide, drug use, racial issues, climate justice. And she used those all through the framework of folklore to talk about those. So again, it wasn't these individual stories, and it was really creative work. And again, I'm happy to sort of follow up on that. Returning to Ghosh, I saw him give a talk a few months ago where he just sort of said, when I asked him what kind of stories we should be telling, he said, maybe we should focus again more on folklore and stories that have animals talking. We used to have lots of those and we don't really have that anymore. So again, just some ideas about stories we can be telling. And again, stories from the future. I'm going to end here with just some questions. Kind of in the introduction, you know, the future, whose future? It's a privilege to think about the future. We have to do it. But if you're busy or stressed out or you're trying to fight for your life to matter, it's really difficult to think about even tomorrow. Again, no less 2030. Just kind of reiterating a little bit of what Lisa mentioned, but kind of discussing, unfortunately, how these climate models work. The kind of newest iteration of IPCC scenarios for climate change in particular are these representative concentration pathways. And they give us kind of these future timelines, effectively storylines for 2100. And there's different, percentages, and they're based on different watts for energy squared, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's how hot the planet is at different stages. And we're certainly on track for the worst case scenario. And so we create policy and law based on these models, these scenarios. But for what it's worth, I just want to sort of point out that we all, of course, maybe not all of us, I can assume, but it is the case that we know climate change isn't caused by all people, right? Climate change is caused by a very small group of people for the most part, and it affects our experiences unequally, right? There are people who are struggling more than others, and it's along racial, gendered, class lines. And yet the way we model climate change is you sort of factor in a human experience as one mathematical layer in a model, right? You have this huge nested system of wind change, ocean currents, blah, blah, blah. And you just kind of put humans in there as one quantifiable layer instead of discrepancy, right? And so you then put the humans in, you plan the entire future based on this really nondescript linear idea of what the human is, right? And I just want to point out that if we're still arguing about which lives matter, how can we possibly imagine a future where they matter, right? The mathematics don't necessarily work there. So it's on us again to sort of change those imaginaries of the future, maybe even to change the math, right? If you're good at that, it's not my strong suit. And I think that's kind of where I want to end, is that it's really important to tell stories. Again, I want to encourage folks to think very broadly about stories, to consider that stories tell other stories, that loud stories tell other loud stories, and to think about which stories are currently valued and the stories that we can create to make 2030 a visceral experience in the present. And with that, I will stop. Thank you. And happy to answer questions about whatever.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm just really curious about, the hero's journey,
yeah.
The sort of narrative story arc. I remember learning about that a lot, and it is something you can see in a lot of different stories. And I'm just really curious what you think about that sort of a template for a story in relation to, what you were just talking about, and also the Gwyn piece that we read for today. So maybe I know we'll probably talk about that later, but that part of what I was thinking about when you were talking is about how I think a lot of times the way we tell stories kind of represents, I don't know, something that's either desirable or not desirable about the kinds of transformations we want to have. And the hero's journey gives you this map sort of for how to change, how an individual person can change, what that can look like and what to expect, sort of. It gives you tools to know how to do that, maybe. I don't know, that's kind of what it was doing for me while you were talking. I'm just curious what you think.
Sure, great question. I think two things really quickly. The hero's journey makes sense to lots of us, in part because that's how our society is structured, right? The hero's journey, if you kind of follow Joseph Campbell and his whole sort of mythology, it's very much based on Aristotle, Plato, these sort of Western thinkers that have more or less become the norm, and that how we still think about things hundreds of years later, which blows my mind. In any case, right, the hero's journey makes sense to us because it is mapped onto our reality. And so I think the onus is on us to reimagine those sort of meta narratives, those meta arcs, and create ways that they can make sense. I think with regards to, how we can think differently about that, and this will of course come up in the Le Guin piece, for starters, is to maybe decenter the hero, right? Who is a hero? What is a hero? That comes up in that piece quite a bit. And with regards to this workshop, I really encourage folks to think very differently about that. But it is a useful arc. It is it's easy to understand, and I think we have to question why it's so easy to understand, right? What we desire is also structured, of course. So that's a short answer to that question.
Hey, John. Thanks so much for that. It's really interesting. I'm wondering about pondering how many different ways a story can be told. We think of a story as being written or transmitted orally, but I like to imagine a sort of a much larger picture. I mean, to have a story be told, you need to have a receiver and a listener. And there may be, many stories being told all around us all the time that we're not aware of because we're just not aware they're being told. I work in sound and music, in ecoacoustics, and can the earth, can the planet, we all know this, and I've sort of realized this, and poetically at least, what are the stories that the earth is telling us? fleeting to us. So I guess my question to you is, beyond the obvious, do you ever deal with the stories being transmitted in ways that are unfamiliar to us, that are non-anthropomorphic in nature? And does that come into play? Can that come into play in how we imagine and ponder this exercise?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think it's a really interesting and necessary way to think about this, right? So in my world, I actually think quite a bit about non-human or inhuman or post-human storytelling, because if essentially storytelling is making sense, right? And as you pointed out, you need a listener and a teller. But if, again, we think of storytelling as essentially making sense, it's really irresponsible to consider that the world doesn't make sense of itself. The onus is on us to listen, right? We're not good listeners. We're not trained to be good listeners. We listen to each other very poorly as humans, and even when we speak the same language. So I think we have to imagine and think very creatively and deeply about what it means to listen to a spider or a cloud, right? And I want to encourage folks to really go there and imagine that, right? Maybe not imagine it, but experience it on your own terms. You know, the world makes sense of itself. Creatures make sense, right? There's a cat running around who just brought me a dead mole, and it's next to me, which is disgusting, but that's this cat trying to tell me something, right? And it's my job to listen. So I want to encourage folks to expand their brains about what sense making can mean. And maybe this can all just be a big exercise in listening. You know, I think the earth is talking, the planet's talking. We're just not very good at listening. I don't see any other hands, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions with regards to, you know, again, discussions of the future. Again, there are lots of great questions to Lisa's point about framing. We sort of given you so far, again, a really meta perspective of crisis. We both sort of focused on climate change, but we're really excited and interested in how other people frame crisis. And then with regards to storytelling as well, like I've thought about this a lot. I'm certainly not the expert on this by any means. I'm really interested to hear others' perspective on storytelling or how to create stories with things that aren't necessarily talking, music.
I don't know if this is appropriate now, but I kind of want to go back to Sarah's question, if you don't mind, about the hero's journey, because I think this might help us also think about being better listeners and maybe thinking about also telling better stories and how to tell better stories. So my bachelor's degree was in film. And in my whole film school life, basically we were forced to read the hero's journey, and then we had to write our scripts that they were hero's journeys. And then 10 years ago, I moved to Germany, where none of the movies are hero's journeys. All of the movies that you showed that are the Avengers movies, they're all hero journeys, right? But European movies are not. None of, I mean, very few of them. And it was very difficult for me to understand them. It was a totally different type of story. And the way that I've come to understand why this can even be is because the systems are different. In the US, you have a very strong industry that makes movies that make money, right? Mostly in Hollywood, but also in New York and other places. In Europe, movies do not make money. They don't generally make a profit. The way that you make a movie is almost certainly you ask for a grant application to a cultural ministry. So then you're making a different type of movie, right? You can't apply with, I'm going to make Iron Man, right? The Nazis coming back movie, Iron Sky, if I'm correct, it was crowdfunded because it doesn't work in this system of cultural grants. So maybe thinking about storytelling, we can also think about the systems that encourage some types of stories and discourage other types of stories. Yeah, just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, I didn't mean to take over, Dylan.
I think we're at a time for the break. And I think this is at the stage where we're gonna end the live stream on Facebook.
Thanks a lot to everyone already. The public part is over now. We'll end the stream.